This is another one of those sermons that I did that was part of a series. Others had already done sermons on the first 3 chapters, and so I was preaching cleanup, so to speak. That's why I asked you to read the first 3 chapters last week. I have to say that when Irv Heichman, the pastor at West Charleston, called and asked if I would be interested in doing chapter 4, I hesitated. When I was in college, my Old Testament professor was looking at the syllabus in the textbook one day, muttering under his breath, and I asked him what was wrong. He said, the material next week is what I wrote my dissertation on. And I said, so we should be prepared for a great week of lectures, right? And he said, I never want to talk about that again for the rest of my life. So after I got Irv's message, I sat and thought, and then I thought some more. I didn't write a dissertation, this was just a master's thesis. And while I'm using that material, I'm not just presenting that paper. I want this to be more fun than that. But if you're interested, I could give you a copy and let you read it. But once I dug it out of the filing cabinet in the attic and read a few paragraphs and thought about the authors I'd studied, it was a whole lot more fun and interesting than I expected after thinking about Ron and his dissertation. The fullness of time. What does that phrase mean to you? In the Old Testament, we find the phrase, the fullness of days, or a reference to days being fulfilled in regard to social contracts or pregnancy. In English, it's synonymous with when the time is ripe, or it carries the meaning of when things or people are ready. If you've watched the Harry Potter films, in the first one, Professor Dumbledore takes Harry to live with his non-magic relatives because he will be much better growing up away from that fame that he doesn't understand. Then Dumbledore places his hand on Harry's forehead and says, until he's ready. He might have said, in the fullness of time. I don't really know why that phrase came to mind when I thought of Ruth 4. It's never used in the story. When it did come to mind, it seemed so familiar, like one of those narrative elements that occur over and over in the Bible. But it isn't that prominent. Maybe it was because this is where the story comes together. All the questions, well, some of the questions are answered, others are raised. But resolution comes to the hero and heroines of the story. Everyone at West Charleston was kind enough to send me their sermons. And I wanted to be sure that I wasn't just repeating things that they said when I did this. I didn't give you that opportunity. And honestly, I would have had to search them out. But I did that before I wrote this, so I think it's a fair conclusion to the story. Now, no judgment, no quizzes. How many took my suggestion to read chapters 1 through 3? Or the whole, 2, 3, 4, great. Well, some of the rest of you may be a little lost, but I refer to the story. Today we get to hear what happens to the characters in the fullness of time. Chapter 3 ended with Boaz protecting and providing for Ruth once again by sending her home before daylight and giving her more grain. Naomi says, wait, be patient, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled. It's very popular when commenting about this story to rag on the men and extol the women. All the men seem to do is die and wait for someone else to do something, while the women seem to arrange everything. I'd like to say a few words in defense of Boaz. Whenever Boaz is presented with an opportunity to act on behalf of Ruth and Naomi, he acts with some speed. In chapter 3, we learn that he isn't the next of kin. So it wasn't primarily his place to look after these widows, but he knows about them. When he finds Ruth in his field, he takes steps to provide for her. Later, after harvest, Ruth shows up at the threshing floor. And when he finds her at his feet, Ruth is always turning up in the most unexpected places. Boaz gives her the news. By the way, feet is a euphemism for genitalia. Anyway, Boaz tells Ruth that there's another relative, a nearer relation. Now we know why Boaz hasn't been more active. It's supposed to be someone else's responsibility. Knowing now that Ruth is interested in him, he's ready to go. And first thing in the morning, he goes to the city gate, where legal transactions are made, kind of like the general store serving as a courtroom in Westerns. Boaz waited. Boaz has been somewhat passive, but now he's ready to take action. What happened on the threshing floor? We don't know. What we do know is that whenever he's presented with an opportunity to act, he does without hesitation. He knows all the social services available in Hebrew society. Gleaning, levirate marriage, and he seems to be the only one that has a good handle on it. The nameless nearer kinsman doesn't fully understand, but that's really essential to the story. Boaz put the legal wheels in motion the next morning. He sat at the gate and waited. Hey, nameless, come and sit. Why don't you elders have a seat too? Would you be thinking setup? Boaz presents the possible transaction and land acquisition, and Nameless agrees, until Boaz says, oh, by the way, it just so happens that along with the land, you get Ruth, a widow, needing a husband to produce heirs for her dead husband, and they would then inherit the land you were purchasing. This causes Nameless some concern, and he's under the impression that this situation will jeopardize his own offspring and their inheritance of his property. So he declines the opportunity, with no adverse circumstances. Let's look at levirate marriage for a moment. The custom comes from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his brother who is dead, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. Formed a committee to treat with him, I'm sure. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face, and she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of the house shall be called in Israel, the house of him that had his sandal pulled off. I wonder how many houses were called. Notice that choice does not seem to enter into it. Duty is the underlying theme. There's another passage about redeeming people in Leviticus, chapter 25, verses 47 to 49. If a foreigner residing among you becomes rich, and any of your fellow Israelites become poor, and sell themselves to the foreigner or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they retain the right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them, an uncle or a cousin, or any blood relative in their clan may redeem them. Or if they prosper, they may redeem themselves. So while our characters are using and benefiting from these customs, they really aren't doing it right. They're combining the marriage aspect with the servitude aspect. And who pulls off whose sandal seems to be fluid. Not to mention there isn't any spitting in anyone's face. But it's essential to our story that Nameless refused so that Boaz can buy the land and marry Ruth. The elders at the gate bless the union. May she be like Leah and Rachel, who built up the house of Israel. May she have have 12 children. And may the offspring of this union be like Perez, the child of Judah and Tamar. This is another out of the ordinary union that we talked about when I talked about Jesus' genealogy. Peculiar to be choosing that one to emulate. But Perez had a lot of children, and many of them became prominent in Hebrew society. When Boaz and Ruth do have a baby, the women say to Naomi, "Praise to the Lord, who this day has not left you without family." Not Elimelech, not Mahlah, or Boaz, or even Ruth. And later they say, Naomi has a son. So Naomi is full once again, but even she does not know how full she is. The final genealogy shows us that Ruth and Boaz's child, Obed, is the grandfather of David, Israel's greatest king. The book is titled Ruth, even in Hebrew, which is not something you would expect from such a patristic or male-centered society. But despite its title, Naomi is a very prominent character. The only life we have known for Naomi is one of loss and bitterness. Her name means pleasant. The famine comes in chapter 1, verse 1. Elimelech dies in chapter 1, verse 3. He never had the pleasure of knowing his daughters-in-law. They don't show up until verse 4. Then, about 10 years, or one verse later, the boys die. Things are pretty rapid-fire miserable for Naomi, and she says so. None of us will deny that Naomi and Ruth and Orpah have run into a really tough stretch. I think, however, there is something to be said for not rushing to the end of the story as we are led to do by the text. Ruth has been loyal, industrious, willing, obedient, serving, cunning, maybe, kind, and loving since we met her in chapter 1. She's kind of a static character. A woman of good character and great moral fiber, don't get me wrong, but she always has been that way to our knowledge. She doesn't change much. Why did Ruth go with Naomi? Why so adamant? We don't know what lay in store for her in Moab. Were there Moabite prejudices against Jews, just as there were against Moabites in Israel? Almost certainly. What would life have been like? Had her family disowned her? Were there social punishments? Had she gone against her family's or her parents' or her father's wishes? We could weave a tale of escaping an upcoming loveless prearranged marriage to marry the dashing young foreigner Mahlah from Judah. But we don't know. Was Ruth a shrewd young woman who had ideas about how life could be in a new land? We don't know. Was she going so as to prove to Naomi that life is not as dark as Naomi was making it out to be? We don't know. Naomi might be the character that changes the most. Or does she? Right before Naomi leaves to return to Bethlehem, she is empty. But when Ruth says, "Don't even ask me to leave you," the tide turns. But does Naomi recognize the fullness that this young companion brings? They have shared experiences. She will have company, conversation, and help along the journey. When they arrive, the women exclaim, "Can this be Naomi?" We might gather that the years have worn hard on Naomi. Perhaps she was not aging well. She responds emotionally, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," which means bitterness, because God has dealt bitterly with me. Don't say pleasant around me, call me bitterness, because that's how God has treated me. When Nancy Heichman preached on this scene, she brought out that perhaps this is why the chorus of women is absent in chapters 2 and 3. We've all encountered people like this before. You greet them and they bite your head off, and you say, "All righty then, I'll just leave you with your thoughts." To Naomi's credit, she was utilizing the social and religious custom of complaint At least in this case, it can be seen as a call to the community to responsibility. After all, Israelite society had some fairly progressive social systems in place. The widow, orphan, and foreigner are held up time and again as people that the Hebrews should be especially concerned with caring for, treating with mishpat and tzedakah, justice and righteousness, and chesed, loving kindness. Those are the Old Testament fruits of the Spirit. It's a recurring theme. God is always telling the Hebrews that this is how they should act, because that is how he has acted toward them. The passages, "My father was a wandering Aramean," and "Remember that you were strangers in the land of Egypt," were part of Jewish liturgy. This last one carries two meanings. They were strangers when they went to Egypt for help during the famine and were reunited with Joseph. In that case, they received aid as foreigners. Later, they were mistreated as foreigners in Egypt. So there's this double-edged message that they should care for foreigners because they know what it's like to need and receive aid and to be mistreated. After that, Naomi doesn't say much. In chapter 2, when Ruth the foreigner asks about going to glean, which Naomi really should have been suggesting, Naomi only says, "Sure, go ahead." Later, she tells Ruth to stay in Boaz's field because elsewhere she might not be as safe. Then in chapter 3, she lays out the plan and tells Ruth to wait for Boaz to resolve the matter. There seems to be a lot of praising God and blessing going on in chapter 4. Notice, though, that it is all on the part of the community. The elders and witnesses at the gate and the chorus of women. The main characters no longer speak. I found it especially interesting that Naomi, who was so vocal about God bringing her back to Bethlehem empty, says nothing about the blessings she and Ruth have received from Boaz, the community, or from God. If I wanted to go after Naomi like many people go after Boaz, I'd say that Naomi doesn't recognize blessing and fullness until it's literally laid in her lap. For when Obed is laid in her lap, she cares for him, but she still doesn't say anything. That may be severe. But I think we can say that Naomi is guilty of overlooking the fullness that exists in her life throughout the story. Yes, there was a famine, but she and her family were able to travel to Moab to find food and work and life. Others had to survive or not in Bethlehem. Her husband died, but she doesn't mention the fullness of her two sons finding wives in a foreign land, and all the fullness of life in those intervening 10 years. 10 years of family life. I imagine this is when Ruth learned about the people of Israel and their religion and the social customs they had for caring for marginal members of society. The 5 of them must have had evening conversations about the Hebrews' homeland, the country, the sunrises and sunsets, the friends and family, the way things were done there, justice and righteousness and loving kindness, and comparisons to the country of Moab. Did Moab have similar customs? We don't know. How much hospitality had they encountered in Moab? We don't know. Maybe Ruth and Orpah were the friendliest people they met. Maybe they were more characteristic than we are led to believe. We don't know. After her 2 sons died, Naomi heard of the fullness with which God had visited her homeland. The famine was over. She prepared to go back home and set her daughters-in-law free to return to their homes. Even before reaching Bethlehem, Naomi's life has begun to fill once again. There is the fullness of a once barren land producing food, and the fullness of a timely arrival at the beginning of barley harvest. And Ruth deciding to go back with Naomi. Does she recognize the fullness that this act brings to her immediate life? Ruth is not only dedicated, she is industrious. Oh, and by the way, remember that the Hebrews just happened to have a system in place for providing for widows called gleaning. This is where they can follow the harvesters and pick up what the harvesters drop. Ruth was all over this. It was her idea. No sooner do they get back than Ruth takes the initiative to glean. And, as it turned out, finds herself in a relative's field. Not only that, but he takes Ruth under his wing, figuratively this time. He noticed her and asked about her, and the foreman tells Boaz that she came and asked to glean, and she was working hard. Boaz tells her to keep to his fields and arranges for her safety, shares his lunch with her, and tells the harvesters to leave grain behind, but not so much that she'll notice and be embarrassed. Ruth takes home her bounty, and Naomi realizes the fullness of Ruth's work. And she asks where she was, and when she finds out it was Boaz, she does invoke God's blessing on him. I sometimes picture her saying, Shazam! Or surprise, surprise, surprise. Or, what do you know? He's a relative, close enough to be a possible husband for you. In chapter 3, the fullness continues. Naomi says she should be trying to find a home for Ruth. Has Naomi changed? She calls Ruth her daughter. She puzzles, shouldn't I find you a home? Boaz has been kind, and he's a relative. Here's the plan. Naomi is taking action. Boaz has been one of the human characters carrying out God's actions. Ruth has been working along and bringing about the divine activity in the story. Now Naomi is being the hand of God. Ruth carries out Naomi's plan. Between the two of them, they call the men to responsibility. Boaz was evidently waiting for the nearer relative, who remains nameless, to act. When he doesn't, and when prodded by Ruth, Boaz says, don't worry. There's a closer relative, and I'll work things out with him in the morning. Naomi says, wait. He won't rest until this is settled. Naomi recognizes the fullness of a willing relative. So in chapter 3, Naomi has begun to come around. Perhaps she didn't know about the nearer relative, which seems odd, but we don't know a lot about the family dynamics. Anyway, she's done complaining, and now she does what she can to make things progress. Again, we learn from Boaz that the decision has not been his to make, but now he's committed to seeing that the right thing is done, and he's going to force it. Naomi's reaction can't be labeled as good or bad, but at least she recognizes that Boaz means business. That is the last we hear from Naomi. In the fullness of time, the transaction is made, and Ruth and Boaz marry. And in the fullness of time, Obed is born to them. And in the fullness of time, we learn that Obed is David's grandfather. And in the fullness of time, David becomes the greatest king of the united monarchy. And in the fullness of time, Jesus is born in the Davidic line. What do we take away from the story of Ruth and her family? 1, God is active in our lives, not only through the unexplainable and spectacular events in life, but perhaps more so through the everyday, mundane acts of humanity on behalf of others. 2, if we are to count ourselves among God's people, we will pronounce God's blessings upon others. We will work to bring those blessings about, and we will praise God for bestowing. That's how God's people act. That's what God's people do. It's part of their societal as well as their religious framework. 3, thinking about the fullness of time as a narrative device can make it seem as if we can only see God's blessings in retrospect, looking back. It is human nature. In the hard times, we voice our complaints and seek God's favor, and then at the end we say, well, that could have been much worse. Things turned out okay. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, right? See how God was at work here and here? The challenge, friends, is to recognize the fullness as it happens. The story is full of hardship and emptiness. The story is full of, but there is also fullness. And if you look closely, you might notice that there is an ebb and flow of emptiness and fullness. It's kind of like that creation story. And there was evening, and there was morning. There will be darkness, and there will be light. Or, as is said in Ecclesiastes, to everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. In our lives, there will be times of utter bitterness, and times of absolute joy. They come and they go. So watch for them. Embrace them. Recognize them as God active in our lives. Look for and find the fullness of God all around you, in nature, in neighbor, in the way people do and don't act. See how God is at work here and now. Treasure and ponder them.